In this video, we're going to look at some of the settings available in the menus of Sea of Thieves, which can be used to improve the motor accessibility for some players. Sea of Thieves is a first-person adventure game where you can sail the seas and play as a pirate, either solo or part of a multiplayer crew. It was first released on Xbox in 2018 by the developers Rare. They have added additional accessibility settings in updates following the initial release. These features can be found in the settings menu of the newly released PlayStation 5 version of the game. They are also available in the current versions of the Xbox and Microsoft Windows version of the games. We will be focusing on using a controller on PlayStation 5, either the standard DualSense, the PlayStation 5 Access controller, or an alternative controller. However, the same settings can be found in the game on Xbox and Windows, and the controls that we mention will use the equivalent controls on those platforms. Keyboard and mouse menu. Playing on PlayStation 5, Xbox or Windows, you have the option of playing with a controller or mouse and keyboard. You could also use both simultaneously. The input prompts will change back and forth between controller and mouse and keyboard depending on the last input used. At the top of the settings menu is a list of the keyboard and mouse inputs, which are organised by their contextual inputs in the game, such as when in a rowboat or using a harpoon. The different in-game actions can be remapped on mouse and keyboard by selecting the action and then selecting the input you'd like to use. Controller menu. Below the keyboard and mouse inputs in the settings menu are the controller inputs. You can view the default controls for each action in the game, which again are organised by context. Here you can also remap each action to another face button, D-pad input, bumper or trigger. However, you cannot map an action to a stick direction, touchpad button, touchpad swipe, options or share. This enables you to use inputs that are easier to access more often and those that are more difficult less often. As the actions are remappable by context, you can use the same input for different actions within different contexts. However, this is only if the actions are mutually exclusive and you can never use those actions at the same time. Being able to remap them by context means that potentially you could reduce the overall number of buttons required. This can be done by remapping a smaller number of inputs to control more actions within different contexts of the game. For example, if pressing the left and right trigger repeatedly when rowing is difficult, it could be remapped to two other buttons that are not used within this context or any other similar context. So here we've remapped the cross and square button to act as the left and right oar when rowing. Now we no longer need the triggers to row. You could also remove the use of the right trigger entirely by changing the other actions mapped to this. For instance, when using a harpoon or for primary use of items in your inventory. In these cases, remapping to the right stick click would not affect other actions. Auto move. There is an unmapped optional action when using a controller for auto move. The action can be mapped to an available button or trigger input on the controller. When the input is used, you will move forwards. This is until the input is pressed again or the move backwards input is momentarily used. This removes the need to hold an input for the duration of walking, such as holding the left stick up by default. For instance, here we have mapped the input to up on the D-pad, so you shall continue walking until you press up on the D-pad again. If you wanted to use an accessibility switch for the input you've chosen, remap one of the 3.5mm ports on the access controller to the input you've chosen in the game. For example, remapping up on the D-pad using an accessibility switch to plug that in as D-pad up for auto move in the game. Radial menus. There is also an unbound action that can be used to navigate the radial menu using a single input by cycling through either clockwise or anti-clockwise. This can be used instead of the default stick input. So for example, if we mapped clockwise to D-pad up, in the radial menu, D-pad up would navigate through the options rather than using the default stick option. Input menu. In the input menu, you can find options to invert the X and Y axes on both the controller and the mouse. You can also adjust the mouse sensitivity and controller sensitivity. The sensitivity options are divided by context, which means that you can change the sensitivity options depending on whether you're using a blunderbuss or a flintlock weapon. In this menu, you can also adjust the response curve and the dead zones when using a joystick on a controller. Below these are some more stick options under the stick subcategory. Stick bindings. The stick binding option is off by default, which means that the left stick moves the character and right stick is used to look and aim. There is a setting to swap sticks, which means that the right stick will be used to move the character and the left stick will then be used to look and aim. You can also choose to use just one stick rather than two. This will combine both movement and turning to one joystick. For example, with this setting set to use left stick only, moving the left stick up and down will move the character forwards and backwards. However, pushing left or right will turn the character rather than strafe. However, you can also choose to use right stick only if you wish to use the right stick instead. As an example, you could use the single stick on the PlayStation 5 Access controller and have that remapped for both movement and looking. Two Access controllers can be paired to give you an extra joystick and additional buttons. You can also connect compatible joysticks and switches into the switch ports on the Access controller. A DualSense can be paired alongside an Access controller to enable two people or the same person to use both controllers at the same time as both player one. Single stick camera mode. When in use, the single stick camera mode option means that when the assigned input is used, you can freely look up, down, left and right using the single stick. This is useful when you need to look or aim beyond your usual field of view. The default input for this is usually the left trigger. This setting is hold by default. So here we are using the use left stick only stick binding to move forward, backwards, left and right. However, when I hold the left trigger, I am able to use that same stick to look in all directions. When I have a weapon in my hands, I'll be able to aim freely in all directions too. When using the single stick mode, the character will stop moving when free looking and aiming. You can also choose to toggle this input rather than hold. In this case, you would press the left trigger once to enter single stick camera mode, and then press the left trigger again to exit. Enable aim assist. Enable aim assist is on by default, which makes it easier to hit targets when using a controller. You can turn off or alter the strength of the different aspects of aim assist, or you can turn off aim assist entirely. Gameplay menu. Reduce hold to interact. By default, certain actions such as lowering the anchor, repairing the hull, or loading a cannon require the player to press an input for a duration until the action is complete. This duration can last between half a second and 3 seconds, which for some players might be difficult to sustain. Turning the reduce hold to interact setting on allows players to complete these actions with only an initial press of the input. So using this setting here to load a cannon, we briefly press the triangle input once and do not need to hold the input whilst the animation completes. Again, here we are repairing the hull by holding a plank in front of the hull and then pressing right trigger to start repairing it. We then wait for the action to complete before moving on to fix the next one. Reduce hold to use item. Some actions require a long continuous hold for various amounts of time, depending on the context. When turned on, the reduce hold to use item setting enables players to toggle through item actions with a press rather than a hold. To stop the action, the player will press the input again. For example, this applies to aiming a weapon, playing an instrument, or raising a lantern. Here we press the right trigger input once to raise the telescope to our eye, and when we are done, we press the right trigger input again to lower. Auto center camera. The auto center camera option automatically returns the camera to the horizon after a specified delay. This reduces the amount that the player needs to manually move the camera with their assigned input. This can reduce the use of a second stick or how much input is required when using a single stick option. When on, it will auto-center the camera to the horizon after an adjustable set of time. By default, this is 3 seconds. You can change this with the auto-center delay slider. Using the auto center speed option, you can adjust the speed at which the camera auto centers. Automatically float in water. Under the miscellaneous subcategory, you can turn on the setting to automatically float in water. This complements the single stick option. Using this means that when you are in the water, you automatically float on the surface. This means that you will not need to use look up or down actions to enable you to swim back to the surface. However, when using this option, you will not be able to swim under the surface of the water. HUD menu. Toggle radial menus. With the toggle radial menus option on, players are able to press the left bumper to open the radial menu, rather than the default setting, which is holding the input throughout the duration of the player choosing and selecting the item. Pressing the input once more after highlighting it will confirm the selection and close the menu. Sticky radial items. The sticky radial items option is on by default. This allows players to choose an item in the radial menu by pointing the stick in a certain direction. They can release it before selecting an item, rather than holding it in that direction until they release the left bumper input. If you select to turn this option off, you will need to hold the stick in the direction of the item until you use left bumper to confirm the selection. Fixed position for interact prompts. This means you do not need to look directly at the interactable item to see what prompts are required for it. These prompts appear on screen to tell the player what inputs are required to interact with certain objects. For example, loading a cannon or raising the anchor. The button prompt for the interaction will appear in the central viewpoint when the player is within reach of using the item. To try out any of the settings we have shown, you can use any of the game modes. It may be that setting sail in safer seas gives you more time and freedom to try these settings. This is because there are no players outside the players invited on your own ship. I hope this video has been useful in introducing some of the options and settings in Sea of Thieves, which may improve motor accessibility for some players. For more information on features like these in other games or alternative controllers, please see SpecialEffect's Game Access site. For game developers interested in more examples of how developers have improved the motor accessibility of their games, SpecialEffect DevKit is our free developer resource. Over 7 main topics, DevKit covers many of the motor accessibility features we look for when looking at how accessible a game may be for some players. For instance, the Reduce Hold to Interact option in Sea of Thieves can be found in Module 3.4, which is under the Input Interactions topic, alongside other examples of how developers have overcome the need for set duration holds in games. The Auto Center Camera option in Sea of Thieves can be found in Module 7.4 under the Simplification topic of the DevKit, alongside other examples of how developers have used automatic analog actions to improve the accessibility of their games. To explore the SpecialEffect DevKit yourself, please visit specialeffectdevkit.info.